The Marine Nationale, which once had been one of the most powerful fighting forces in the world, had been in a state of decline at the end of the 19th century. Despite France's efforts to remain a top contender in the naval arms race, problems in design and procurement had left them far behind the British. It wasn't surprising, therefore, that when HMS Dreadnought appeared on the scene, the French insisted on completing the Danton class, their last class of pre-dreadnoughts, before they even began development on their first class of dreadnoughts, the Courbets. Being somewhat later to the dreadnought arms race, the French had the benefit of being able to learn from other nations' experiences. As such, they rejected the hexagonal turret layout that plagued classes like the Nassau's, and also recognized the superiority of superfiring turrets as had been introduced by the South Carolinas. Additionally, propulsion would not be an issue, as the French left behind the old triple expansion engine in favor of the Parsons steam turbine. Underwater protection was prioritized, and the ship's armor scheme was extended below the waterline to protect from underwater hits. These ships also had thinner armor than their contemporaries, but over a greater area across the hull. Despite being 544 feet long, the forward turrets were situated very close to the bow, and as such the Courbet class were very wet ships, having a tendency to plunge dramatically. Displacing just over 23,000 tons, they were heavily armed, possessing 12 12-inch guns, in a traditional superfiring layout, but inconveniently having two wing turrets on either flank. This represented a blend of the superfiring and older wing turret styles, with the French Navy not quite being forward enough to simply install a single turret on the centerline instead of two on either side. The secondary battery was made up of 22 5.4-inch guns, along with four 1.9-inch guns and four 17.7-inch submerged torpedo tubes, completing the armament. Armor was thinner than on other first-generation dreadnoughts, only having 5.5 to 9.8 inches of armor making up the belt, with a 1.6 to 2.8-inch thick deck. Turrets were shielded by 9.8 inches of armor, with the conning tower protected by 10.5 inches, rounding out the armor layout. Two steam turbines drove four shafts to a design speed of 21 knots, though this would be exceeded handily in service. The Courbet class made up four ships: Courbet, France, Jean Bart, and Paris. The ships were built in pairs, with Courbet and Jean Bart laid down in 1910, followed by France and Paris in 1911. All were ready for action by the time of the First World War. Following the outbreak of hostilities, the newly formed allies of Britain and France agreed that the British would handle the North Sea and the English Channel defenses, enabling the Marine Nationale to concentrate its strength in the Mediterranean Sea. This would be done to bottle up the Austro-Hungarian Navy, which had grown far more powerful in recent years with the addition of the Tegetov-class battleships. Courbet became the flagship of Admiral Augustin Bou de la Peyre, who quickly made proactive moves to show the strength of his forces. Sweeping into the Adriatic, he aimed to surprise the Austro-Hungarian forces blockading Montenegro. His force of combined British and French warships, including Jean Bart, succeeded in sinking the protected cruiser Zenta. The remainder of 1914 was spent providing fire support to the Montenegrin army, but this came to an end when U-12 fired a torpedo at Jean Bart, hitting her directly in her wine storages. This room was situated directly next to her forward magazines, leading the British to wonder if this was a possible method of underwater protection that they had overlooked. Jean Bart was able to proceed to Malta unassisted, where she would receive repairs. The ships then took part in numerous patrols, but by the end of the war they were extremely worn down, with few supplies having been able to be spared as France fought for its life on the Western Front. Coal shortages meant the ships could not sail for very long, and all four were nearly immobile by the signing of the armistice. After the war, France and Jean Bart were sent to the Black Sea to bombard Bolshevik positions. The crews subsequently mutinied, but this broke down when the French admiral in command agreed to bring the ships home. All were permitted to be retained under the Washington Naval Treaty, but France would be wrecked after striking an uncharted rock and being too damaged to save. Jean Bart was modernized twice in the 20s, but her condition was so poor that the French deemed she could not continue to serve, and she was subsequently converted into a training ship in 1936. A year later, her name was changed to Océane to enable the second ship of the Richelieu-class battleships to become Jean Bart. Both Courbet and Paris would be modernized, but were still considered outdated, such that they were placed in training capacity. Fortunately for them, at the outbreak of World War II, they were still in good enough condition to rejoin the fleet, and both units formed the 5th French Squadron. Despite this movement, they continued training until they were placed on active status on the 21st of May, 1940, by which point the situation in France had decidedly taken a turn for the worst. Paris would evacuate 2,800 men to Plymouth on the 14th of June, sailing at the painfully slow speed of 7 knots. Miraculously, she made it, and was seized by the British as part of Operation Catapult. 6 days after this, Courbet sailed for Portsmouth, where she too would be seized as part of the same operation that took Paris. Both would be placed in the capacity of depot ships, with Courbet being scuttled to form a Mulberry Harbor during the D-Day landings. The ex-Jean Bart was captured by the Germans when they tried to seize the French fleet at Toulon, who used her to test explosives before she was recaptured by the Allies, being broken up where she lay shortly after the war's end. Somehow, Paris managed to survive the war, and was returned to the French Navy, where she continued to serve as a depot ship for another 10 years before being sold for scrap in 1955, over 40 years after she had been completed. The Courbet class reflected the complicated status of the French Navy in the earlier 20th century, as a powerful yet disjointed force. Nevertheless, they were extremely good ships who far outlived many of their peers who went to the breakers after the end of the First World War, a testament to their quality. Thank you so much for watching. If you have a suggestion for a future video, please leave it in the comments below.